So yeah, as Rachel said, we're going to be talking about uh, the overview of included studies and syntheses table, which is essentially summarizing what studies we have and how we're using them in the review, and how we can do that in a way that's helpful and clear, both to us as the authors of the review and anyone who's reading it. So hopefully that'll be something a bit practical and useful. Before I get into the detail, I just want to acknowledge, as we always do in Australia, that I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, which is also called Naarm. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their custodianship of the lands where they live and work. So as Rachel said, I have a lot of different hats across Cochrane. I do want to take a minute to acknowledge some of the other people who worked on this content that I'll be working on today. So the tables that I'll be talking about, we've been talking about in Cochrane Public Health for quite a while. We originally had some guidance developed by Hilary Thompson, who was a former coordinating editor of Cochrane Public Health, and also my colleague Alex Hall at the University of Newcastle also helped develop this work. So this is by no means just me. It's a lot of people have put some thought into this. So we'll begin by just asking you a couple of questions about yourself, and I believe Dario is going to help me out by launching a poll, just to see where you're at in terms of these tables, which are a little bit new for Cochrane reviews, but maybe not so much for other reviews. So I think that's the results there. So we can see that we've got a bit of a spread. We've got a few people who are new to the whole thing, which is great. Welcome along. Some people who've been doing this for a long time and are quite comfortable summarizing study characteristics. So hopefully you'll find this useful too. Some people who've done reviews before, or people who've summarized characteristics before in other kinds of research. So that's great to know. Thank you. So then I guess one thing that we always want to start with when we're thinking about methods is why we're doing it and what the objective is that hopefully these methods can help with. And the reason we want to summarize the included studies for a systematic review is to really communicate that information clearly to our readers, so that they know what kinds of studies we've found, what they need to know about those studies. But it's not just about the paragraphs at the beginning of your results when you're telling people about those key study characteristics. This kind of summary can really help them navigate the whole review. So it can really help them work out how you're grouping studies together, what you're comparing to what, and they may well want to refer back to that table frequently as they're reading later sections of the review. So it can really help them as a quick guide when they're reading a section of the results that's talking about a particular comparison of interventions or a particular outcome, and they think, hang on a second, which one of those studies were the interrupted time series, or were all of those studies looking at that same intervention? They can look back and get some quick information about that. So there's really, if we can make this table as useful as possible, it's really helpful to our readers. Now, I think this is applicable to all systematic reviews. I think we can do a good job of this regardless of the kind of question we're asking. But there are some circumstances where it's particularly helpful. So if you're looking at a more complex review, if you've got lots of different intervention types in your review, or you've got multi-component interventions that you want to talk about, what are the bits and pieces that each particular study has, then that's really helpful. If you have a lot of studies, then a succinct summary can also be very helpful. And if you've got a lot of differences, so different study designs that might be compared differently or synthesized differently in the results section, or if you're using synthesis methods other than meta-analysis, where you don't have a nice handy forest plot to summarize the results, then these characteristics can also be really helpful to your readers to help them navigate around. So why are we thinking about doing this right now? Well, those of you who've been around Cochrane reviews for quite a while will be familiar with our characteristics of included studies tables, which are quite detailed summaries of the characteristics of included studies, hence the name. This one's from one of my reviews, just so that you can see that I am guilty, just as guilty as anyone else, of perhaps giving a bit too much information sometimes. So in this particular review, We had 14 included studies, and the table of characteristics ran for 48 print pages on the PDF version. Now, while there was a heap of useful and interesting information in there, and we were trying to describe some quite complicated health interventions with multiple components around exercise and diet and so on, that's not a useful summary for a reader. They might want to dip in and have a look in detail at some studies that they found interesting particularly, but in terms of interpreting our results, flicking through that 48-page table is not going to help them. So we think there's probably a better way to do that. Unfortunately, just that is coming along. So Cochrane's revisions to the way the reviews are structured, what they're calling the focused review format, is progressively being introduced right now. And I think by, someone may correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think by about March next year, it'll be rolled out across all the Cochrane reviews. But the idea is to restructure the reviews a little bit to help make the main review document easier, more succinct, more accessible for our readers to get what they need out of the documents. And so one of the things that's happening as part of that format is that the table of characteristics of included studies is moving to additional or supplementary information, won't be included in the main review PDF. And so what we're then encouraging everyone to do is to include this new overview of included studies and syntheses to characterize the key information that people need to get their heads across at a glance. So with that in mind, I'd really like to know what you think would be the useful things to put in such a summary table. All right, thanks everyone. So it looks like intervention groups are the most important. Population groups and comparators, outcomes, study designs, all very important to people. Less so the risk of bias. Number of participants is up there again, and the results drop off again. Thank you. That's really helpful. And hopefully you'll be pleased to see that I agree with most of you. But also, one of the things that's important to acknowledge with this is that the thing that you need to summarize is the thing that's going to be the most useful to your readers. So what are the key characteristics of your review that are going to be the most important to understanding what's going on? So your review might have different objectives, for example, relating to different subpopulations of people. You might have a review with a very wide variety of study designs it's important to clarify. You might have some particular characteristics that will really help people understand what's applicable to them. So it might be the setting in which the studies were conducted, and so on, you know, high versus low income countries, urban versus rural settings, for example. So you will know best what's going to be the most important characteristics for your review. And I think it comes back to advice that comes up quite a lot when we're talking about how to conduct a systematic review, is that sometimes, you know, there is no one right answer in terms of how to do it. What we recommend is to have a think about why you're doing the review, try to do something sensible, and then explain it clearly, which is possibly not very specific advice, but I think it's always good advice. So it should be ultimately, you should focus on what are the most important characteristics for you. You should try and keep it focused on those most important characteristics, because you want this table to be clear. You want it to be easy to refer to. And one kind of rule of thumb for that is, could you print this and have it make sense? So if you can get it on a single page, that's amazing. You might have too many studies for that, and that's completely to be expected in some Cochrane reviews. But if you've got the number of columns would allow you to print it and it would look sensible once you printed it, then that's a good guide that it's probably clear enough. But if you've got so many columns that you couldn't print it, then you probably might need to go back and think about what's really the most important, or maybe there are some secondary characteristics you want to present somewhere else. So the things that I would usually recommend considering, the study ID just tells you which study is which in a Cochrane review, so that one's really helpful. But some other things that are often of interest include the location, country, or other setting characteristics that might be of interest in your review. the study design, unless you've only included randomized trials, that might not be helpful, but you might want to flag, for example, cluster randomized trials or crossover studies with methodological characteristics that are important. Might not apply to your review though. Sample size is often of interest to people. People like to know that when they're, although we take that sort of thing into consideration in our analysis when we're thinking about grade assessments and so on. People like to know that about the included studies. The characteristics of population and intervention, really useful these. And the key things that we'd love to focus on are those characteristics that you are using to structure your synthesis. So that might be where you might have completely separate parts of your review. For example, you might have information on adults and information on children, completely separate in the review. You might have different comparisons, so different intervention types that are set up in separate analyses. You might have key characteristics that you're looking at in your subgroup analysis. And those are the characteristics that will be most helpful to people as they're reading the results. They can flick back and see which studies are sitting in which categories and how things are being grouped together. It's possible to include the outcomes in the table, and usually we would say that is listing which outcomes those studies addressed. So either the outcomes they reported or the outcomes that we used in the synthesis of the review. If you've got space and it's important to your particular review, you can certainly give more information about that, such as measurement tools used and time points measured. That can sometimes be too much information for this summary table. Again, depends on your review. And there may well be other characteristics that are the key. The things we would suggest not including in the table include risk of bias assessment, and that's largely because these days most of the tools that we use to assess risk of bias, that assessment's done on the basis of specific results and not the study as a whole. So different results from that study might have different levels of risk of bias. And as we group studies together across, for example, in a meta-analysis or another synthesis, we're looking at the overall risk of bias across that group of studies. So it may be more useful to discuss that or present it separately. If you're using forest plots, you can present the risk of bias on the forest plots, and that can be a more helpful place to do it. If there's secondary characteristics that are interesting, you want to record them, but they're not key to understanding how the review is structured, then that might well work in a secondary table. As I mentioned before, if you've got characteristics that are the same for all or most studies, if you've only got randomized trials, no quirky characteristics that you want to represent, and the study design is probably not going to be important to include in that table. And we'd suggest not including results on the table. And that's because although we can structure the table in different ways, these characteristics tend to be sorted by the particular study. And so what that can mean, I'll show you an example of what that might look like. This is not a Cochrane review, which isn't to say it's not an excellent review, but it's just a non-standard layout. But you can see that I've just got a couple of rows from this table, and we've got some key characteristics, the size of the study. We've got, obviously those abbreviations are explained in this review, but we've got some key population characteristics in there, which is really useful. We've got which type of intervention it is, which is really useful. At the end, we've actually got results in the table. And what that means is, for example, if you wanted to see the results for BMI, you'd be scrolling up and down this table looking for studies that measured BMI, and all those results would be presented separately. And so it's not really how we want our readers to be engaging with those results. We'd much rather them see that in the context of the synthesis, where all of the results for BMI are looked at together, their certainty is graded, their interpretation is there, and it's a much more reliable summary of the results for those readers to see. So are there any questions at that point so far?
We have had one question in the chat, Miranda. So Jacqueline has asked, so one of the things I struggle with regarding the population is whether to include the inclusion criteria or the main baseline characteristics. So an example in neonatal reviews is that the inclusion criteria might include infants below a certain gestation, but when we look at the mean gestations, there can be wide variation and skewing towards one end or the other. So any comments on that?
Well, I guess for this purpose, the key thing to put in a summary here, and if there were key factors that might affect your interpretation of the results later, you might want to discuss that in more detail in the review. So in this summary, I would probably categorize, rather than try and describe, say, as you could put, the individual eligibility criteria for each study or the mean for each study. I would probably lean towards using what was actually found in the study. But I might actually find it even more useful to categorize that in ways that are important for interpretation. So, for example, if there's a real difference between, first week of life and up to 3 months, then that might be a good difference to highlight. So it's probably in a summary format helpful to readers to really tell them what the difference is they need to pay attention to. So whether it's the difference between older babies and younger babies, or whether it's, it might be helpful to use categories, perhaps as well as reporting the means. But whatever you think the key thing is that people need to understand about the results. But yeah, again, there's no best way to do it. You would probably know your reviews best yourself about what are the key things you want people to take away. Any other questions?
Yeah, that's it for now, Miranda. Thanks.
Great. All right. So in that case, if we've thought about what we might want to put on the table, let's talk about how we sort it. So how would you think would be a good way to organize this information? All right. I think this is one of my favorite things, where everybody's got a different opinion, and I like it. Again, there can be lots of different ways of grouping the studies. And all of these could be valid depending on your review. So I would probably say my favorite way to organize the tables is by the comparison, because that's how the rest of the review is structured. So if people are looking at the results, they'll be looking in a Cochrane review, they'll tend to be looking by comparison, which will tend to be based on interventions and the comparators. But that may or may not be how your review is organized. And so it may be helpful to structure it by different populations. You can obviously have more than one level of structure, so you could group it by category and then flag different populations and organize it that way. Outcome can be helpful. It can be a bit trickier though, because if you've got studies reporting lots of outcomes, you may end up having studies popping up in lots of different places. Study design, again, can be helpful depending on your review. I might lean towards putting that as a second or third level of organizing the data, maybe group by comparisons and then subgroup in the table by, sort in the table by study design, so you can see which of the randomized trials, which ones are the others. Alphabetically can be a tricky one. So if we're using it as a lookup reference and we're referring to the studies by name in the review, then alphabetically can help people find, okay, where is that study by Thompson? And they'll be able to look it up and find it. So that can be a useful way to do it. Though if you've got a lot of diversity in your review and a lot of studies, it can mean that the studies are not sitting next to the other comparable studies that are reporting on similar interventions. And so that can be a bit harder for people to get a snapshot of the group of studies that might be contributing to a particular comparison. By risk of bias, I might not do that for this table, but I might do it in other circumstances. So an example where I might do that is if I'm using methods other than meta-analysis to synthesize the results, or if I'm reporting the results of individual studies that aren't synthesized or aren't in a meta-analysis, then sorting them by risk of bias can be really helpful to help readers evaluate which are likely to be the most reliable results. So I might do it then. But let's have a look at some examples of these tables. And this is, it's quite funny trying to make this presentation. I was trying to think of, interesting pictures and so on I could add in, but really what I'm showing you is a bunch of tables. So I apologize for that, but hopefully it'll be useful. So we've got a couple of different examples here. And as I said, these are not the perfect way to set up a table. Depending on your review, you might have a much better idea. But they're just designed to give you an indication of the ways you might set it up. And also, obviously, because I'm trying to fit it on a screen, these are just sections of tables and not necessarily the whole table that covers all the studies in the review. So in this particular example, we've got studies grouped by the intervention category. So education and financial incentives in the top section, moving on to financial only, and then I'm getting this type of review where you're looking at those kind of multi-component high-level interventions. There will often be a number of different categories after that. But we have got the study design flagged because we're using RCTs and control before and after studies. And then we've got another key element of the intervention, which is tailored versus not tailored, which was obviously important to interpret in this particular review. We've got a snapshot of the population, so adults and children, women only, and that can be helpful for thinking about applicability or implementation of the results. We've got some information about which outcomes are measured. So we've got the general domain of outcomes, so mental health, respiratory health. Then we've got the specific outcome measures used, the names of the scales or the definition of the outcome. We've got when they were measured, so short term, longer term, and then whether they were included in a meta-analysis or in another summary of results. So there's quite a lot of information there about each included study. I'll show you another example next, which is, again, from a multi-component intervention review. And this one's actually based on an example in the Cochrane Handbook, Chapter 9, which is a great reference for this, and I encourage everyone to have a look. And the purpose of this table isn't just to summarize the overall study characteristics, but it's really trying to explain what the multi-component interventions look like. And so this is a review of self-management interventions, and this can have a number of different components to it. So it can have health-directed behavior, constructive attitudes and approaches, emotional well-being, positive and active engagement in life, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, I'm reading those explanations of the acronyms from below the table. So you might have a different way of setting up, explaining those components. But the idea is to really break down in this complex intervention which studies are using which kinds of components, and to really dig into that detail of how these multi-component interventions are working. And that can then be explored in the results with this handy reference guide for people to come back and have a look. And so the studies in this case are just indicated by the numbers on the left. They haven't got the name of the authors there, but that's where you might put the study ID in. So this one doesn't provide as much information about the population and so on, the setting. This one's really focused on understanding that key complexity which people are going to need to understand to interpret the results of the review. And then again, some information about the outcomes measured by each study. If you had the kind of review where each study was contributing 7 or a dozen outcomes, that might get a bit out of hand on these tables, but depends how yours goes. And so this is a slightly different one. So this one is set up alphabetically. This one was a Cochrane Public Health Review that looked at social media interventions for a range of different health outcomes and health behaviours. So it was really quite a diverse range of studies. And so again, we've got the study design in that second column there, because there were a range of different study designs included interrupted time series, control before, after, and randomized trials. And one thing that's a little bit different about this study, they've highlighted which of the randomized trials are cluster randomized trials, which are indicated there as CRCT. And in the last column over on the right, they've one of the key things when you're including cluster randomized trials in a review is that you need to ensure that clustering was accounted for in the analysis, and either ensure that that was done in the included study itself, or you need to adjust those results as the author of the review. And so they've used this table just to clarify that methodological characteristic, just to confirm that, yes, that was taken care of, and either it was done in the original study, or here's the assumptions or the calculations we did as authors to include that result in the review. So as a methods person and a methods editor, I find that super useful. Other people might not find it quite such a high priority, but just a different way of, a different type of information that you might find. They have included overall risk of bias at the study level in this example here. Again, I probably wouldn't usually do that, but they've found that useful here. We've got population categories. So this is general populations versus targeted populations who have particular conditions are being targeted for particular health messages. So because this is a population level social media intervention, that's useful in this case. We've got social media only versus multi-component interventions is the key distinction they were drawing there in their analysis. So they're not trying to break down which additional components there were. They're just differentiating between something that was only on social media or something that was part of a bigger intervention. What the comparators were, again, outcome domains and specific outcome measures there. So I mean, that's just a few examples. There are a lot more, but I'm interested to know, well, why don't we say, I'll ask if there was any questions first, and then I'll let you have a little think and see. In a minute, I'll ask you whether you've got any suggestions or examples of reviews that you've worked on that you would think might be the key characteristics to summarize or sort by. Rachel, do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, there's a couple. They're both kind of about actually creating the tables.
Yeah.
So Matteo's asked, he was referring to the previous table with the color coding.
Oh yeah.
Do you know how
here
to create similar tables in RevMan Web? I don't know if we're going to cover this in a bit in your presentation.
I will show you quickly at the end how to set them up in RevMan Web. Sadly, I do not know how to make them colored in RevMan Web. So I'm not sure I can replicate that one for you specifically.
Yeah, no, me neither. I think there might be a couple of people on this presentation who might be more experienced with RevMan Web. So I will just see if I can kind of identify anybody who might be able to answer that question.
Well, I'm sure it may not have been at the top of their development list, but if you really had something complicated you want to convey and you thought something like colors would be helpful, I guess a workaround would be to add it as a figure, and then you could put in any design elements you wanted, but that would make it less of a table for you.
And then we've got another question from Matteo to say about using covidence for data extraction. So do you have any tips for setting the covidence template to facilitate the creation of the tables in the results section?
Unfortunately, so I don't use covidence for data extraction, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be the best person to tell you what those features are. But I think the key thing that I would think about when I'm setting up my review, and this will help with your data extraction, with thinking about, when you actually get to the point of needing to run your synthesis, and also setting up the study-centric data entry in RevMan, which is kind of another topic that I'm not going to cover in detail. But I think the key tip I would have is having clear idea right from the beginning about what your categories are. And so making sure that you've collected information about, or that you've clearly tagged your results in terms of which reviews fall into which categories. And so RevMan, I can't speak to covidence, but RevMan study-centric data entry will let you categorize and group your interventions. So you might have a specific intervention and then like a label for an intervention type that you can add. You can add other variable names in RevMan, which will let you tag things as, for example, being like adults versus children, or particular the study designs you could flag are obviously, that's relatively straightforward to categorize. But I think in planning the review, if you've got a clear idea about the categories you're using, then it will help you tag and group things in a sensible way. I'm not sure that doesn't help you with Providence at all. I'm sorry.
No, thanks. We've got some, helpfully, Denise has said she thinks that coloured tables would have been created outside RevMan and added as a figure, as you said, Miranda.
Thanks, Denise.
And Elizabeth Royal has also thinks that colours are going to go on her RevMan web wish list.
Excellent.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And we've got one more question from Emma. Thank you for the presentation. What is your advice on managing these tables in reviews with a very large number of studies, and just a concern about how huge these tables could get?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think then when you've got huge reviews, and it probably depends what type of review it is. So if it's a review that has sort of natural categories, big overarching sections or different intervention types, you could break the table into several separate tables. But some of those reviews, I'm thinking some of the pregnancy and childbirth reviews, for example, have relatively straightforward clinical questions, but hundreds of studies, and there's no really there may not be a straightforward way to separate them out. I think I would just be as clear, like as succinct as possible and as minimal as possible about what it is you wanted to convey, and then structure that table in a way that helps people. So subheadings and sorting by key characteristics can help people navigate it a bit, so that if they're looking at a particular intervention category, they know which section of the table they're looking for. It doesn't solve that problem necessarily. If you're trying to summarize characteristics of lots of studies, I mean, you could, in theory, set up a table that didn't list every study individually, that perhaps set out intervention, those key characteristics, and then said we had 12 studies with these characteristics, and perhaps list the study IDs in a single table. I think the flexibility in RevMan Web now, you don't just have to have one row per study, so you can set it up in a more flexible way, and collapse it like that by perhaps setting up a row for a particular set of characteristics and then indicating how many studies you have with those characteristics and which ones they are. But I've just suggested that off the top of my head, so there might be a really good reason why that's a bad idea that I'm sure someone will let me know.
Thanks, Miranda. That's all the questions for now.
All right. So then I'll just keep flicking through. And in a timely fashion, let you know how to set it up in RevMan Web. So essentially what you're doing is setting up, and I'm sure the others will jump in. I was playing with this today, so I think this is up to date, but please do interrupt me if I've got anything wrong, as I know RevMan Web has changed a lot recently, and I'm not the master expert of RevMan Web. But essentially what you're doing is setting up an additional table. And you can do that. So this tables button down here will let you set up a table essentially with any characteristics you like. So just jumping forward, that's what it looks like when you set up a new table, and you can tell it how many columns it has. You can set your own column and row headings. As I mentioned before, it's not limited to having a row per study ID, but you can use the link button, which is in the middle of that row of buttons there, to include internal links, including links to study IDs in the table there. So you could set that first column up to have a study ID per row, or you could set it up differently. And you can decide how many columns you want. You can decide what those subheadings are and add them in, format the text. So it's a lot more flexible. For users of RevMan 5 will recall that we didn't have such flexibility in the tables, but we do now. This is an example that's actually provided as part of the excellent RevMan team's resources to help discuss the flexible review format. So the RevMan knowledge base has information about a number of different aspects of the flexible review format. This example you can click on in their resources and their guidance, and it will set this example up for you in your RevMan account so you can play around with it. So I didn't set up this table. This is an example that's available. If you want to have a look at it, you certainly can. And so in this particular example, again, this one's a little bit different to those I've discussed before. We do have one study ID. Text is a little bit small. Hopefully you can read it. One study per row, but they've noted the location of the study in that same cell, which is quite helpful. They've put in the study design. They've noted how long the study was, as well as what type of study. And they've got some abbreviations in there to tell you a little bit more about that particular study design. So whether it was double-blinded is one thing they've put in there, and so on, which you may or may not find useful. They've got the number of participants randomized and various other characteristics about the population. They've got some information about severity at baseline, and they've given quite detailed information there. So I tend more to lean towards broad categorizations, but obviously that's not always what you need. Sometimes you need some more specific information. And at the end, they've got a list of which outcomes have available data. So there's no perfect way to set it up, but you can certainly choose your own characteristics and add them to a table like this in RevMan, and it is quite flexible and relatively straightforward to do that, which hopefully is reassuring. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you. Like I said, it's not super complicated what we're talking about today, just trying to give you some examples and have a think about why we want to do what we're doing. There's some resources there. Handbook Chapter 9 is quite useful, but also the Cochrane website, that link there, or you can also just Google Cochrane Focused Review Format, which is what I did to find that page. And that website page links through to the knowledge base. It has a list of other resources and that are available to help with the transition to the new review format. In the RevMan knowledge base, there's a link to a document that was drafted by the team at Cochrane Public Health. So as I mentioned, I worked on that, as did Hilary Thompson and Alex Hall. And I think Dario is going to add a link to that document when the recording of this webinar goes up on the training site, but you can also get to it from the RevMan knowledge base where it talks about setting up these tables. Yeah, and you can always email me, although like I said, I'll probably just say whatever works best for your review is the best way to do it. But you're always very welcome to contact me. And that's all I really wanted to cover, but I'm really happy to answer any other questions if there are any.